The air at the Henderson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid Iowa cocktail of diesel fumes, sweat, and the sweet, sad smell of freshly cut alfalfa from the neighboring field. It was the scent of failure, a smell Jedediah Stone knew all too well. He stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed over a faded chambray shirt, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron. He wasn't here to buy land. He couldn't afford it, and even if he could, he wouldn't buy a man's sorrow. He was a scavenger, a vulture picking at the bones, looking for a bargain on a used disc blade or a set of cultivator shovels. Up on the flatbed trailer, the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Harris with a voice like gravel in a coffee can, was working his way through the smaller items. Wrenches sold for $1, log chains for $5. The real machinery, the hardware of a man's life, sat lined up in the yard, their paint faded under the relentless July sun. A John Deere 4010, its tires cracked and worn, went for a price that made Jed wince. A New Holland baler, barely 5 years old, was snapped up by a young farmer with a fresh bank loan and an ambitious smile. Then Harris pointed a thick finger toward the end of the line, at a hulking beast that seemed to sag under its own weight. "All right, folks. What we have here is it's a Steiger, a Bearcat, Series 1. Four-wheel drive, cat diesel power, or so the side of it says. We ain't tried to turn her over. The bank says the engine's seized up tighter than a drum. We're selling it for scrap, parts, or for a real ambitious man's headache. What am I bid for this piece of American iron? Let's start it at $1,000 for the whole shebang. $1,000, who'll give me 1,000? Silence. The crowd shuffled. A few men chuckled. The tractor was a monstrosity. Its original lime green paint was almost entirely gone, replaced by a deep scaly orange rust that covered every panel. The tires were massive, but two were flat, the rubber split open like rotten fruit. The cab was a simple steel box with shattered glass on one side. It looked less like a tractor and more like a monument to a forgotten war. From the front of the crowd, a voice boomed. "You'd have to pay me 1,000 to haul that junk heap away, Harris." The laughter was louder this time. Jed recognized the voice instantly. Richard Miller. Rich, as everyone called him, had inherited the farm next to Jed's 5 years ago and had been on a buying spree ever since. He stood there in a clean new pair of overalls, a seed company cap perched on his perfectly combed hair. Beside him, the local John Deere dealer, a slick man in a green polo shirt, smirked in agreement. "Well now, Rich," the auctioneer shot back, "not everyone can afford a brand new four-wheel drive with air conditioning and a radio, can they?" "It ain't about affording, it's about being smart," Miller retorted, loud enough for the whole county to hear. "You buy junk, you get junk. That thing will cost more to fix than a new one. It's a boat anchor." The dealer nodded. "He's right. We wouldn't even take that thing on trade. The engine alone. You're looking at a Caterpillar 3160 V8. Parts are a nightmare to find. It's a dead end." Harris sighed, seeing his commission on the machine evaporate. All right. Let's get real. Somebody give me $500. $500 for the scrap iron. The tires are worth that." More silence. Jed watched, his mind working. He saw past the rust and the flat tires. He saw the frame, built from thick, unforgiving railroad steel. He saw the massive planetary hubs, built to withstand torque that could rip a lesser machine in half. He saw the simple mechanical linkages with not a single delicate wire or solenoid in sight. His father's voice echoed in his head, a low rumble from years past. "Look at the bones of it, boy. Paint is cheap. Good iron is forever." This Steiger had good iron. $200, Jed said, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden lull. Every head turned. Rich Miller spun around, a look of disbelief on his face. He squinted, saw it was Jed, and a cruel grin spread across his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in, Jed Stone. Figured you'd be sniffing around the scrap pile. What in God's name are you going to do with that thing, Jed? Plant it and hope a new one grows." Jed ignored him, his eyes locked on the auctioneer. Harris's eyes lit up. "I got $200 from Jed Stone. 200. Now who'll give me 250? 250, anyone?" The crowd was dead quiet now, watching the drama unfold. No one was going to bid against Jed for a piece of junk, but they were sure as heck going to enjoy the show. "Come on, Jed," Miller sneered. "Save your money. You could buy a whole new set of shovels for your walk-behind planter for that much." Jed's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He just stood there, solid as an oak stump. $200 once, Harris called out, his gaze sweeping the crowd. Twice. He paused, looking directly at the dealer and Miller, giving them one last chance to mock or to bid. They just shook their heads, laughing. Sold. Harris's gavel, a rusty ball-peen hammer, banged against the trailer's fender. For $200 to Jedediah Stone. Son, you just bought yourself a whole lot of work. As the crowd dispersed, moving on to the next item, Miller swaggered over to Jed, the dealer in his wake. "Seriously, Jed, I'm curious. You gonna part it out?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Nope," Jed said, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. "Then what? Stick it in the front yard to scare the crows?" Jed finally turned to look Miller in the eye. His own eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, but they held a steady, unblinking intensity. "I'm gonna get her running." Miller and the dealer exchanged a look, then burst out laughing. It wasn't a friendly laugh, it was sharp and dismissive. "Get it running?" Jed, the bank's mechanic, said the block is probably cracked from sitting all winter with water in it. The pistons are welded to the cylinder walls. You got a $200, 20,000-pound paperweight. "We'll see," Jed said, turning and walking toward the auctioneer's table to settle up. He could feel their eyes on his back, could hear their muttered jokes. He didn't care. He had work to do. "Now, before we get into the guts of this old Steiger, and believe me, we're going to go deep, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever bought something that everyone else called junk? Something that was laughed at and dismissed, only to pour your own sweat and blood into it and turn it into gold? Maybe it was an old truck, a piece of machinery, or even just a rusty tool from a flea market. Let me know down in the comments what your greatest scrapyard find was. I read every single one, and I love a good story about bringing old iron back from the dead. Getting the Steiger home was the first battle. It took 2 of his biggest tractor tires, filled with water and calcium for weight, just to balance the back of the old grain truck he used as a hauler. He had to use 2 hydraulic jacks and a stack of oak blocks to lift one side of the tractor high enough to wrestle the 2 flat shredded tires off the rims. The lug nuts were frozen solid with rust. He soaked them in penetrating oil for an hour, then went at them with a 3/4-inch drive breaker bar with a 6-foot steel pipe slid over the handle for leverage. He put all his weight on it, his muscles screaming in protest, until the nut finally broke free with a gunshot crack that echoed across the empty farmyard. It took him half a day of brutal, soul-crushing labor just to get 4 borrowed wheels onto it, so it could be winched onto the trailer. By the time he pulled into his own lane, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. His farm was a stark contrast to the sprawling modern operation Rich Miller was building. Jed's barn was old, painted a faded but respectable red, the roofline straight and true. His house was a simple white clapboard, modest but clean, and in the machine shed sat his pride and joy, a 1968 John Deere 4020 with a side console. It wasn't the biggest or the newest, but he'd rebuilt the diesel engine himself 3 years prior, and he knew every bolt and seal on it by heart. It was paid for. Everything on his farm was paid for, a legacy of his father's hard-learned lessons from the Great Depression. Debt, his father used to say, is a chain you forge yourself, one payment at a time. His wife, Sarah, came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the rusted hulk on the trailer, then at the exhaustion etched on her husband's face. She didn't say a word about the money, she just asked, "Supper's on. You think you can get washed up before it gets cold?" That night, after a quiet meal of meatloaf and potatoes, Jed went back out to the shed. He didn't turn on the main lights, just a single bare bulb hanging over his workbench. He circled the Steiger, running his calloused hands over the cold, rough steel. Miller's words echoed in his head. "The block is probably cracked. The pistons are welded to the cylinder walls." He knew it was possible, likely even. But as he laid his hand on the massive, silent V8 engine, he felt not a sense of dread, but a flicker of connection. This machine was like him. Old, underestimated, and full of a quiet, stubborn strength that the flashy new world had forgotten. The next morning, the real work began. The tear down. He started by draining what was left of the fluids. The radiator coughed out a foul-smelling, rust-colored sludge. The oil pan was worse. It was filled with a thick, milky grey slime, a sure sign that water had gotten into the crankcase. Not a good sign. He pulled the injectors first, carefully labeling each one, then the valve covers. The sight underneath made his stomach clench. The rocker arms and push rods were coated in a layer of hardened, rusty gunk. He spent 2 days just clearing a path to the engine block, removing the hood, the radiator, the turbocharger, and the tangled mess of hydraulic lines. Each bolt was a fight. He broke 3 sockets and skinned his knuckles raw more times than he could count. The air in the shop grew thick with the smell of penetrating oil, sweat, and rust. Finally, it was time to pull the heads. The head bolts on that Caterpillar 3160 were torqued to a specification that would snap a lesser man's tools. He used his biggest breaker bar, the 6-foot cheetah pipe slipped over the end, and had to brace his feet against the tractor's frame. He threw his entire body weight into it, grunting with the effort, until the first bolt broke loose with a terrifying groan. He worked his way around the head in the correct sequence, a slow, methodical process that left his arms and back screaming. With the help of his engine hoist, he lifted the first cylinder head free. He swung it over to the workbench and looked down into the exposed cylinders. His heart sank. It was just as Miller had predicted. The cylinder walls were scored and pitted with rust. A dark ring of corrosion marked the spot where the pistons had sat, motionless, for years. They were seized solid. Any other man would have given up right there, called the scrapyard, taken his loss, and endured the "I told you so's" at the co-op. But Jedediah Stone was not any other man. He looked at the frozen engine not as a failure, but as a puzzle. He spent the next week trying to break the pistons free. He filled the cylinders with a cocktail of diesel fuel and automatic transmission fluid, a trick his father had taught him for freeing up stuck engines. He let it soak for days, but they wouldn't budge. He tried tapping the tops of the pistons with a brass drift and a heavy hammer. Nothing. He tried heating the block with a propane torch, hoping the expansion would break the rust's grip. Still nothing. Word of his struggle got around the county. It became the morning's entertainment at the coffee shop. Heard Jed Stone still out there talking to that rusty tractor of his, one would say. My boy drove past last night, said he had a fire going under the oil pan. The man's gone crazy. Rich Miller, of course, was the lead conductor of this orchestra of scorn. He'd make a point to drive his brand-new air-conditioned International 1066 down the road past Jed's place, slowing down just enough to kick up a cloud of dust that would drift into Jed's open shop. One afternoon he stopped, letting the big International's diesel engine rumble with impatient power. "Still playing with your toys, Jed?" he yelled over the noise. "I just put in 120 acres of beans before lunch. How's that project of yours coming along? Figured out how to make it float yet?" Jed didn't even look up from the engine block. He was meticulously cleaning the gasket surfaces, his focus absolute. The insult rolled off him like water off a duck's back. He had a problem to solve, and Rich Miller wasn't part of the equation. Finally, Jed decided on a last-ditch, brute force approach. He found a massive oak block and cut it to fit perfectly inside one of the cylinders, resting on top of a piston. He took his biggest sledgehammer, a 16-pound monster he used for driving fence posts. He stood on the tractor's frame, took a deep breath, and swung. The sound of the sledgehammer hitting the oak block was a deafening crack that echoed through the machine shed. He swung again and again. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. On the 10th swing, he felt something give. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a shudder that ran through the entire engine block. He swung again, and this time the piston moved a fraction of an inch with a deep, grating groan of tortured metal. A slow, grim smile touched Jed's lips. He had found a crack in the fortress. It took him 2 more days of this back-breaking work, but one by one he drove all 8 pistons out of the block. The aftermath was a scene of mechanical carnage. The pistons were junk, the rings fused into their grooves. The cylinder walls were badly scored. The crankshaft, thankfully, looked salvageable, but the block itself needed serious work. He loaded the massive, greasy engine block onto his truck and made the long, slow drive to a specialty machine shop in Waterloo. The old German machinist there, a man named Klaus, looked it over, wiping his hands on an already black rag. "Well," Klaus said in his thick accent, "it is bad, very bad, but the block is not cracked. It is good iron. Ver can bore it .30 over, maybe .40. Find you some new pistons, new bearings. It will cost you." "How much?" Jed asked, the words catching in his throat. Klaus did some figuring on a notepad. The number he came back with was more than Jed had paid for the entire tractor. It was more than he had in his savings account. To pay for it, he'd have to sell the small herd of feeder calves he was raising, the little bit of extra income he and Sarah counted on for emergencies. It was a gamble, a huge one. If this engine didn't run, he'd have lost the calves and still be left with a pile of useless parts. Sarah looked worried when he told her, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. "If you think it'll work, Jed," she said softly, "then you do what you have to do." He sold the calves the next day. The check felt heavy and hot in his pocket as he drove back to Waterloo and handed it to Klaus. "Do it right," was all he said. While the engine was at the shop, Jed worked on the rest of the tractor. He rebuilt the hydraulic pumps, replaced every cracked hose, and rewired the entire electrical system, which had been chewed to pieces by mice. He sandblasted the rust off the rims and put on a set of used but solid tires he found at a salvage yard. He didn't have money for paint, so he just coated the bare metal in a thin layer of primer to keep the rust at bay. The tractor looked even uglier than before, a patchwork of grey primer and orange rust. 3 weeks later, Klaus called. The engine was done. Jed brought it home and, with the meticulous care of a surgeon, began the reassembly. He torqued every bolt to spec, checked every clearance with a plastigauge, and primed the oil system by hand. Finally, the day came. The engine was back in the frame. The fuel lines were bled. 2 brand new, heavy-duty batteries were hooked up. He climbed into the simple steel cab, the seat a mess of ripped vinyl and exposed springs. He took a deep breath, the smell of fresh diesel and new paint filling his lungs. He turned the key. The starter groaned, straining against the fresh, tight engine. It turned once, twice. A puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack. He gave it a little more throttle and turned the key again. The engine spun faster, and then, with a thunderous roar, the Caterpillar V8 exploded to life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet purr like Miller's new International. It was a deep, guttural, angry bellow, a sound that shook the very foundations of the machine shed. Black smoke poured from the stack before settling into a steady, hazy rhythm. Jed let the clutch out, and the 20,000-pound beast lurched forward, rolling out of the shed and into the sunlight for the first time in years. It was ugly. It was loud. But it was alive. The timing couldn't have been better. It was the late 1970s, and the American heartland was booming. Spurred on by massive grain sales to the Soviet Union, commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn that was $1 a bushel a few years ago was suddenly pushing $3. Land values doubled, then tripled. A wave of delirious optimism swept through the farming community. The mantra from the banks and the government was simple: get big or get out. No one embodied this new philosophy more than Rich Miller. He was the golden boy of Black Hawk County. The high grain prices meant his profits were astronomical, and he used every penny of it as leverage. The bank manager, a man named Henderson who saw Miller as the future, gave him a line of credit that would have made a king blush. Miller bought the original Henderson farm, the one that had gone under at the auction. He bought the 80 acres to the south of Jed. He traded in his 2-year-old 1066 for a brand new, top-of-the-line International Harvester 3788, a 2+2 model that looked more like a spaceship than a tractor. When that wasn't enough, he went to the John Deere dealer and bought a massive 8640 articulated 4-wheel drive, complete with jewels all around, a heated cab and a stereo system. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres, all of it on borrowed money. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, standing in front of his fleet of new equipment, smiling like a lottery winner. Jed, meanwhile, stuck to his own 400 acres. The old Steiger, which the locals had nicknamed the Rusty Dragon, proved to be a godsend. It wasn't comfortable, and it broke down often enough that Jed kept a full toolbox in the cab, but its raw power was undeniable. It could pull his 24-foot field cultivator in soil that would have brought his 4020 to its knees. He was able to get his fieldwork done faster, hitting the optimal planting and harvesting windows. The good years were good to him too. He had money in his pocket for the first time in a long time. But he didn't spend it like Miller did. He didn't buy more land. He didn't buy new trucks. He put a new steel roof on the barn. He replaced the old fence lines. He bought Sarah a new Maytag washer and dryer, paying for it in cash. He built up his savings account, putting money into certificates of deposit at the local bank. In the coffee shop, he was no longer a madman. He was a fool. "Can you believe Jed Stone?" they'd say, shaking their heads, "sitting on a pile of cash when land is going up 20% a year. He could be a millionaire by now. His old man taught him to be scared of his own shadow." They saw his discipline not as wisdom, but as a lack of ambition, a failure of nerve. He was the man who missed the boat, stubbornly paddling his little rowboat while everyone else was sailing by on luxury yachts. One cool afternoon in the fall of 1979, Jed went to the bank to renew one of his CDs. Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, ushered him into his office. He was wearing an expensive suit and had the confident, easy smile of a man who was winning. "Jed, good to see you," Henderson said, gesturing to a leather chair. "Rolling over that CD again, are we?" "That's the plan," Jed said. Henderson leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You know, Jed, the interest rate on this is 7%. That's not bad, but it's not keeping up with inflation. You're losing money by letting it sit here." He slid a file across his polished desk. "Rich Miller was just in here. We just financed him a new combine, a Gleaner N6. The man is a visionary. He's using our money to make himself a fortune. Land values in this county are projected to go up another 30% next year. You can't lose. You could take this money, use it as a down payment on the old McGregor place. We could finance the rest. The land will pay for itself in 2 years." Jed listened politely, but a familiar tight knot was forming in his stomach. He'd heard this talk before. It sounded too easy, too good to be true. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Henderson," Jed said, standing up, "but I think I'll just stick with the CD for now. I sleep better at night." Henderson sighed, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "Suit yourself, Jed, but opportunity doesn't knock forever." As Jed walked out of the bank, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The town square was bustling. New Ford and Chevy pickups were parked along the curb. The stores had fresh paint on their signs. Everything looked shiny, prosperous, and permanent. But Jed looked past the shine. He saw the interest rates on the sign in the bank's window ticking steadily upward. He heard the farmers in the cafe talking about their operating loans, how the rates had been adjusted up again. He felt a change in the wind, a subtle shift that no one else seemed to notice. The party was in full swing, the music was loud, and no one realized the storm clouds that were gathering, dark and ominous, just over the horizon. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. It was the summer of 1980, and the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey plate. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by July, stood stunted and yellow, its leaves curling inward as if in prayer for a single drop of moisture. Jed felt the drought in his bones. He walked his fields in the evenings, the dust rising in fine puffs around his worn work boots. The yield would be a fraction of normal, but his costs were low. He'd burn less diesel during the harvest, and with no massive loan payments hanging over his head, he knew he would survive. He'd tighten his belt, like his father had, and weather the storm. For Rich Miller, the drought was a catastrophe. He was farming fence row to fence row, 2,000 acres of thirsty corn and soybeans. He'd bought the most expensive hybrid seed, applied thousands of dollars worth of nitrogen fertilizer on credit, all based on the assumption of a bumper crop and high prices. Now his investment was shriveling on the stalk. The real blow, however, came from halfway around the world. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter declared a grain embargo. The primary customer for American corn was suddenly gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Prices collapsed overnight. The $3 corn that had fueled the boom was suddenly worth $1.50 if you could find a buyer at all. The mood in the county turned sour. The easy optimism of the 70s evaporated like a morning dew. In the coffee shop, the talk was no longer of new tractors and rising land values, but of operating loans and foreclosure notices. One afternoon in late August, Jed was in his shop, replacing a leaking hydraulic hose on the Steiger. It was a simple, greasy job. He had a box of assorted fittings and a roll of high-pressure hose on a shelf. He cut a new length, crimped on new ends with his bench-mounted press, and had the old tractor ready to go in under an hour. As he wiped the grease from his hands, he saw Miller's new Gleaner N6 combine being hauled down the road on a lowboy trailer, heading away from Miller's farm. A few hours later, he saw Rich Miller's pickup truck pull into his lane. Miller got out, and he looked like a different man. The swagger was gone. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out with worry. He held a small black plastic box in his hand. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy, I saw you were working. I need some help." "What's the trouble, Rich?" Jed asked, leaning against the Steiger's massive front tire. Miller held up the box. "It's the circuit board for the grain monitor on the Gleaner. It fried. The whole machine is dead without it. The dealer says they don't have one in stock. Might be a week, maybe two, to get one from the factory in Independence. It'll be over $2,000 for the part alone." He kicked at a loose stone on the ground. "My beans are shattering in the field. I'm losing bushels every day it sits. I can't wait 2 weeks." Jed took the circuit board and looked at it. It was a marvel of modern technology, with tiny little transistors and capacitors soldered onto a maze of green pathways. It was also completely alien to him. "Can't help you with this, Rich," Jed said, handing it back. "This is beyond me. Looks like you'll have to wait." Miller's shoulders slumped. "Yeah, I guess so." He looked from the delicate circuit board in his hand to the massive, simple engine in Jed's Steiger. The rusty Dragon was all brute force and mechanical logic. There wasn't a computer chip on it anywhere. "How do you keep this old thing running?" he asked, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. "I fix it," Jed said simply. "A wrench, a hammer, and some common sense. That's all it takes." Miller just shook his head and walked back to his truck, the useless piece of plastic clutched in his hand. Jed watched him go, then looked back at the Steiger. For the first time, he saw the rust and the dents not as flaws, but as a badge of honor. It was a symbol of resilience, of a machine built to endure, not to be thrown away. It was a survivor, just like him. That was the first crack in Miller's empire. The second came from the bank. The easy credit dried up. Mr. Henderson was no longer smiling. When Miller went in to ask for an extension on his operating loan, the answer was a firm no. He was forced to sell his herd of beef cattle at a rock-bottom price just to make the interest payment on his land. The house of cards had begun to tremble. The trembling became an earthquake in the early 1980s. To combat rampant inflation, the Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates to levels not seen in a generation. Prime lending rates soared past 20%. For farmers like Rich Miller, who had bet the farm on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His loan payments didn't just increase, they tripled. A debt that had seemed manageable when corn was $3 a bushel and interest was 7% became an impossible crushing weight. The wave of foreclosures that followed was a biblical plague. Farm auctions became a weekly occurrence, grim affairs where families watched their entire lives sold off piece by piece on the courthouse steps. The shiny green and red tractors, the symbols of the boom years, were now lined up like prisoners on death row, their value plummeting as the market became flooded with used equipment. Jed survived. His lack of debt was his shield and his armor. While his neighbors were paying the bank 20 cents of every dollar they earned, Jed's money was his own. His savings, tucked away in those foolish CDs, were now earning double-digit interest, a small but steady stream of income that helped offset the disastrously low crop prices. His greatest asset, however, remained the rusty Dragon. One spring morning, the injector pump on the Caterpillar V8 began to leak, a steady drip, drip, drip of diesel fuel onto the hot engine block. He called the cat dealer in Waterloo. The man on the phone whistled. A new pump was a special order item. The price was $4,000. Jed hung up the phone, a cold knot in his stomach. $4,000 was money he didn't have to spare. He could park the tractor, but his spring tillage would be set back weeks, and he couldn't afford a new machine. He walked out to the shed, opened his father's old metal toolbox, and started taking the pump apart himself. It took him a full day of meticulous work. He laid out each tiny spring and plunger on a clean rag, in the exact order he removed them. He cleaned decades of grime from the intricate parts with a toothbrush and a can of carburetor cleaner. He finally found the problem. A tiny brittle O-ring, no bigger than his thumbnail, had disintegrated. The heart of the problem was a 10-cent piece of rubber. He took the old O-ring to the local hydraulic supply shop. The man behind the counter, an old-timer named Gus, rummaged through a dusty set of drawers and came back with a perfect match. "That'll be 50 cents, he said. Jed drove home, carefully reassembled the pump and bolted it back onto the engine. He bled the fuel lines and turned the key. The V8 roared back to life, the leak gone. The total cost of the repair was 50 cents and a day of his own time. He had saved himself $4,000. That was the difference between survival and ruin. Rich Miller had no such luck. The bank finally called his loans. The foreclosure notice was nailed to his fence post, a stark white rectangle against the weathered wood. An auction was scheduled. It was the end of the line. The day of the Miller auction was the opposite of the one where Jed had bought the Steiger. It was a cold, blustery day in November. The sky was a uniform sheet of grey. There was no festive atmosphere, no laughter. The crowd was small and somber, mostly neighbors who had come not to bid, but to bear witness. The equipment was lined up in the yard, the same spot where Henderson's machinery had sat years before. The massive John Deere 8640, Miller's pride and joy, looked forlorn, its green paint dulled by the weather. The auctioneer, a different man this time, with a sad, tired voice, could barely get a bid. Tractors that had cost $100,000 just a few years earlier were selling for $20,000. The John Deere dealer who had once laughed at Jed was nowhere to be seen. His own dealership had gone bankrupt 6 months prior. Jed stood at the back just as he had before. He wasn't there to gloat. He felt a profound sadness. He saw Rich Miller standing near the porch of his house, a house his grandfather had built. Miller was a ghost, his face gaunt, his eyes staring at nothing. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, tears streaming silently down her face. The auctioneer moved on from the machinery. "All right, folks," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Now for the real estate. We're selling the home quarter, 160 acres, with the house, the barn, and the outbuildings. A good, solid farm. What am I bid?" Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. No one had the money. The only people with cash were the insurance companies and the out-of-state investment groups, vultures circling to pick the bones of the heartland. Jed felt a surge of something deep inside him. It was his father's voice, the memory of his grandfather's struggle, the sight of the Miller family about to be cast out with nothing. He thought of the CDs in the bank, the money he had so carefully saved. He thought of Henderson's condescending advice, of the laughter in the coffee shop. He took a step forward. "I'll bid," he said, his voice clear and strong against the wind. "I'll bid $100,000. Cash." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Every head turned to look at him. The auctioneer's eyes widened. He knew it was a low price, but it was a real bid. A cash bid, from a man who was good for it. He looked toward the back of the crowd, where a man in a suit, representing the bank, gave a slight, desperate nod. "I have $100,000, the auctioneer called out, a spark of life returning to his voice. "Do I hear 110? 110,000? There was only silence. The bank was desperate to get the loan off its books. No one else could bid. "Going once," he said, his eyes on Jed. "Going twice." He paused, scanning the grim faces. "Sold for $100,000 to Jedediah Stone." The auction was over. As the crowd quietly dispersed, Jed walked not to the auctioneer's table, but across the yard to where Rich Miller was standing, frozen in disbelief. Miller looked at him, his expression a mixture of shame, anger, and utter defeat. He expected a final, cruel twist of the knife. "You came to laugh," Miller choked out, his voice thick with emotion. You came to see me lose everything so you could pick it up for pennies. Jed shook his head. He looked Miller straight in the eye. No, Rich, I came to stop the bleeding. He paused, letting the words sink in. I don't need another house. The place is yours to live in. You can rent it from me for a price you can afford. Your kids shouldn't have to change schools. Miller stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. And another thing, Jed continued, his voice softer now. This is more land than I can handle by myself. I could use a good man to help me run it, someone who knows this ground. I'll pay you a fair wage. The dam of Rich Miller's pride finally broke. He crumpled, his head in his hands, and sobbed. They were not the tears of a broken man, but the tears of a man who had been shown an impossible, undeserved kindness. Jed just stood there quietly, his hand on Miller's shoulder, until the storm had passed. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The coffee shop talk changed. Jed Stone was no longer the fool who missed the boat. He was the wise man who had built an ark. His name was spoken with a quiet respect. They talked about how he'd saved the Miller farm, how he worked side by side with the man who had once been his rival. Rich Miller, humbled and grateful, proved to be the best hired man a farmer could ask for. He worked with a quiet intensity, his arrogance replaced by a deep, hard-won wisdom. The two men, once separated by a chasm of pride and philosophy, forged a bond in the shared soil of their neighboring farms. Jed never got big. He farmed his original 400 acres and the Miller 160. He paid his bills on time, kept his equipment in good repair, and put a little money away each year. He bought Sarah a new kitchen and took her on a trip to the Rocky Mountains, the first real vacation they'd ever had. Life was not easy, but it was secure. It was his. One warm summer evening, years later, Jed was in the machine shed with his grandson, a boy of 10 with bright, curious eyes. The shed was clean and organized, a lifetime of tools hanging in their proper places. In the corner, covered by a canvas tarp, sat the Steiger. It was mostly retired now, used only for the heaviest jobs, but Jed could never bring himself to sell it. It was more than a tractor, it was a part of him. The boy was flipping through a new farm magazine, his eyes wide at the pictures of the massive, gleaming new tractors. They were technological marvels, with GPS guidance, climate-controlled cabs that were quieter than a luxury car, and price tags that looked like the national debt. "Grandpa," the boy asked, pointing to a picture of a giant green machine. "Why don't we have one of these? It's got 24 forward gears and a computer that drives for you." Jed smiled and walked over to the corner of the shed. He pulled back the tarp, revealing the old Steiger. Its primer grey and rust-orange paint job looked ancient next to the glossy photos in the magazine, but it had a dignity, a solidness that the new machines lacked. He ran his hand over the thick steel fender, the metal still warm from the day's sun. "I want to tell you something your great-grandpa told me a long time ago," Jed said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He knelt down so he was eye-level with the boy. "He told me to always look at the bones of a thing. That new tractor in the picture, it's full of wires and computers. When one of those little wires breaks, the whole thing stops. And you have to pay a man in a special truck a lot of money to come and fix it. You don't own that tractor, son. The bank does. And the company that built it does. They own you." He patted the Steiger's massive tire. "This old girl here," he said, his voice filled with affection, "she's different. Her bones are good, solid iron. When she breaks, I can fix her with the tools on that wall. I don't owe anybody a dime on her. She works for me, not the other way around. She's an asset, not a liability." The boy looked from the old, scarred tractor to his grandfather's weathered face, his blue eyes clear and steady. He was beginning to understand. "Paint is cheap and shiny things fade," Jed said, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders and pulling him close. "But good iron, son, good iron is forever. And freedom from debt is the only thing that lets you truly own the work of your hands. Don't you ever forget that?" The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farmyard. The light caught the old Steiger, and for a moment the rust and the primer seemed to glow with a deep inner fire. It was the quiet, stubborn glow of survival, a testament to the man who saw past the scorn and the rust, and found the enduring strength within. It was the heart of the farm. It was his legacy.